All right. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Dennis Pennington, Weed Extension Specialist for Michigan State University. And yeah, we have had some significant freeze events here over the last few days. And Jeff, you did a really good job of kind of describing how cold it got and for how long. And so I've been getting quite a few questions from farmers as well as agribusiness about, okay, so what does that mean for the wheat crop that's growing out there in the field? So what I hope to do today is try to quickly go through the things that you need to look for in the field, and then have some time for some question and answers toward the end of this thing. So the first thing I want to do is just talk to you a little bit about how cold can wheat tolerate temperatures. And this is a chart from Kansas State University publication on spring freeze injury to wheat. And basically, it depends on what growing stage you're in. The first column is the growth stage, and you see it takes us from tillering to joining, booting, heading all the way down and through maturity. And the second column is the approximate injurious temperature for 2 hours. So what this means is that if you get down to, in the tillering stage, down to 12 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 hours, that's the point at which you would expect to start to see injury. Now, the level of injury and the amount of damage and the yield reduction potential will depend on, how much colder than that it gets and for how long it gets colder than that temperature. Now, much of the wheat in Michigan is in the jointing stage. In fact, I think almost all of it is. Every field that I've been in has been anywhere from Feeks 6 to about Feeks 8. We have a little bit of Feeks 8. Most of it's Feeks 6, just early 7. Feeks 6 is when one node is visible above the soil surface. Feeks 7 is when there's 2, and Feeks 8 is when there's 3 nodes above the soil surface. And you can see that at that point, if you have 2 hours of temperatures down to about 24 degrees Fahrenheit, you can cause some injury to wheat. And there are some places in the state that did approach that threshold. And the other thing to remember, if you look down here toward the boot growth stage down here, that temperature bumps up to 28 degrees. And so fields that are a little bit further along, maybe it was planted earlier, that are in that Feeks 7 or Feeks 8 and hit, even the upper 20s, could have a little bit of damage out there. In terms of what to look for out in the field, these are the symptoms that you would typically see in the jointing stage. Leaf yellowing or burning, death of the growing point is certainly the most important concern, splitting or bending of the lower stem, and then a corn silage odor. And these two photos are kind of typical of what I've been seeing out in the field. The leaf tip is burned back some. If you're just walking the field and looking at this, this is mostly cosmetic damage. The flag leaf is still emerging from the whorl or has not yet emerged from the whorl, and that's one of the most important leaves. So the yield impact of seeing this kind of damage is fairly low at this point. That's kind of what I've seen for the most part so far. I have not seen any death of the growing point yet, but we're a little bit early to really assess that. In terms of you determining how much yield damage you might have or how much yield loss, you really have to identify the growing point, that developing head, find that in the stem, and assess how much damage you have in the field before you can make any decisions as far as what to do about it. In terms of scouting, some things to remember, these plants are going to remain green. So even if the head is damaged in the stem, if you're just driving by a field and you look out over it, it's still green a week after a frost, you might say, well, I'm okay. Things are fine. Even if you get out and walk the field and you notice the leaf tip burn or a little bit of discoloring of the leaves from the frost, you might get a false sense of security that, hey, my wheat's in good shape, I'm okay. The only way to really know how much damage you have to slice open that stem longitudinally and expose the head. That's the only way to do it. The head, as long as the head is white or kind of a yellowish green and it's turgid, you're in good shape. And by turgid, I mean if you squeeze it between your fingers, there's some pressure there. If it's mushy, on the other hand, in your fingers, or off-white or brown, and it has a silage odor, you've got some damage on that head, and you need to then make assessment. All right, how many of those tillers have the damage? And then you can start to figure out how much potential yield loss you might have. But you have to get out there and slice these stems open. In order to do this, in order to know kind of what to look for in the field, you got to know a little bit about how to stage wheat. And so this is an image that's taken from a publication that Sean Conley put together out of University of Wisconsin. the Visual Guide to Winter Wheat Management, Development, and Growth Staging. And this is the picture of Feek 7 growth stage. And the reason I wanted to show this is because the nodes are fairly easy to see on here, and particularly this one down here. This is the first node. That's that kind of bump in the stem that you're looking for. Now, what I usually do is I'll pull a handful of plants right out of the ground, and then I will take my thumb and forefinger all the way down to the base of the stem, and I'll run my fingers up the stem, feeling for these bumps in the stem. In this particular case, we have two nodes. So the question here, if you're at Feek 7, where is the developing head at? Where do you need to cut that stem open to find it? The answer is that the developing head is located just atop the uppermost node. So in this case, it's located where that red arrow was at Feek 7. If you were at Feek 6 and you only had one node visible, that developing head would be just above it down here. So that's where you need to slice open the stem and identify is that growing point alive. So usually what I do, you got to have a really sharp knife, and the more narrow the knife is, the better. An X-Acto knife works best. It's difficult to slice open a stem without actually cutting through the head. So this is what I've done here in this picture. So the uppermost node, in this particular plant was at Feek 7. So this was the second node, is located here, and then you can sort of see the developing head here. What you need to do is you need to carefully dig that developing head out of that stem and evaluate. And this is what it will look like when you get it dug out of there. And you can see that the head looks kind of that lightish green, a little bit whitish toward the top, kind of light green down here. In this particular case, you feel that with your fingers. It is not mushy. It did not have an odor. It's not off-white or starting to be necrotic. So this head, I would say, is probably going to be okay in okay shape here. And you can start to see some of the spikelets on this head as well. Now, one of the things that you're not able to tell at this point, because there's no damage showing up here, you could have individual spikelets or florets within a spikelet that have some damage. And the damage is caused by when the temperatures get cold enough, the water in the extracellular space freezes. And if the freeze is bad enough, it can cause cell membranes to rupture. And if them cell membranes rupture, you can cause damage to either parts of the reproductive organs within a spikelet or just physically with a spikelet itself, causing it to not be able to function normal. And there you have your yield loss. So I would be getting out and looking at fields and dissect, open up the stem and find the head and see what that looks like at this point. A couple of pictures that I've got here. This picture on the left was sent to me by Phil, and when he sent this, the first thing that I noticed here is look at the color of the stem. It appears that there's some discoloration, perhaps even some necrosis on the stem. If you're seeing this in your field, you need to get out there and scout as soon as possible and find out what's going on. You want to dissect that stem open, see is this damage going all the way through? I mean, is it going to kill the plant and basically everything above it's going to die or what? So if you're seeing that kind of damage, you really need to get out there and do some looking. In this particular case, when we went out in this field and looked, what happened was we peeled this upper leaf down away from there, and where the leaf sheath wraps around the stem down here, there was just some kind of artificial damage. In fact, it was more of like a purpling color, just only along that leaf sheath wrapped around the stem. The stem itself was nice and green. And turgid, there was no problem with it. So in this case, I don't think there was anything other than some cosmetic damage here. And some varieties are going to show this more prominently than others. There's some varieties that won't cause this purpling color along the stem, and some will. The picture on the right comes from out of Nebraska, and this is a lower stem that is actually split open. And when I was out on Saturday morning, while it was still freezing, so I got out here about 7 o'clock in the morning, there were some pretty crispy stems. I have not found any that were split open like this, but if you do find this is a significant candidate for lodging and also for secondary infection of diseases as well. So if you have this kind of damage in the field, that would be a concern to deal with. So in terms of really assessing where we are, this freeze happened Saturday morning and actually Sunday morning and Monday morning. It's really a little bit too early to tell. Martin shared these pictures with me, Martin Nagelkirk, and if you're seeing this kind of damage where the leaf emerging out of the whorl is brown, necrotic, and dried, basically what that means is the growing point inside here has died in the stem. So the plant still remains green, but these leaves that we're trying to push out are no longer alive because that growing point is dead. You will not produce a head on these plants. So we are not at the stage yet where you can see this kind of damage yet. It's going to take a week or 10 days, and we need the warmer weather that Jeff has said is coming before we're going to start to see some of this damage appear. We need a good week, maybe even 10 days before we would see any of this kind of damage. And the other thing I mentioned that, there could be some individual spikelets that show some damage. Here's some pictures of some heads with some freeze damage on it that Martin sent to me also. And you can see, and this was taken about flowering time, you can see the anthers shed on these heads, but you can see the yield loss is going to be different depending on how much damage you had. And where we're at in the current growth right now, you can dig that head out of the stem and see what it looks like, but you're not going to be able to accurately assess this kind of damage on the head. So we've got to let it grow. We've got to let it have a little bit more time to figure out how much damage we think we will. I would suggest we think about starting to scout next week. And particularly if you're seeing some of these damage symptoms that I'm showing you, get out there and walk those fields and make sure you dissect the plants. I don't want to talk a whole lot about management options just yet. Manny Singh and I are putting together an article that will come out probably mid next week about, what do you do if you have damage on wheat? And really we have kind of only 3 options to look at. Number one, if you've got a low amount of damage, keep it and harvest it just like you normally would. If you have a heavy amount of damage and you don't know if it's worth it, you don't think it's worth taking it to harvest, you can harvest it as a forage crop. If you're going to do that, you're probably going to want to cut it when the head is in the boot stage, and we are probably a week, 10 days away from that stage. So that decision will have to be made fairly soon, but that's only works for people that need the forage or have neighbors or somebody else that needs it. And the third option is to terminate the crop and plant something else in there. There's not really anything from a management perspective you can do other than get out there and look and see and assess what kind of damage you have. There is an article that I put together that you can access. If you just Google wheat freeze MSU, it should be the top article that shows up. I've also got a YouTube video that's linked within that article that shows me dissecting a plant and opening it up and explaining how to find the head and assess whether the head is alive or viable or not. So those resources are available for you to access. Just one last reminder before I wrap up here. When we get into this warmer weather, wheat will move through the growth stages fairly rapidly. And we have wheat at our Mason Research Station that's Feeks 8 right now. We could be flowering within 2 to 3 weeks here. That means that we need to be thinking about fungicide application for head scab. Fusarium head blight is our #1 disease problem in Michigan. There's really kind of 2 things that you need to think about in terms of dealing with Fusarium head blight. Those are choosing resistant varieties. That's not something that you can do anything about right now, but when you choose varieties to plant in the fall, try to select varieties that have a higher level of resistance. There's no truly resistant varieties out there. Everything has some level of susceptibility, but there are some that have some resistance to head scab. And then the second thing is to apply a fungicide at flowering, and that's Feeks 10.51. We have 3 good options for fungicides in Michigan: Crumba, Prosaro, Miravis Ace. Miravis Ace is a new one that has some potential for widening the window of application a little bit, which might make things a little bit easier for us. If you're a white wheat grower, you're probably automatically planning on a fungicide application. If you're a red wheat grower, you might be saying, well, I want to put fungicide on if I need it, but if I don't want to spend the money. Remember, there's this head scab prediction model at Penn State University, and basically what it does is it looks at the weather forecast and projects out what level of risk you have. Are the weather conditions right and favorable for the development of the disease? And if so, the map will show some of these red colors. This is a map that was taken actually yesterday off from the website. And you can see off to our south down in Kentucky and Tennessee, they have conditions that are very favorable, and they are right nearing that flowering timing down in this part of the country. So they are at risk down here for infection from Fusarium head blight. Normally at this time I would, spend a little more time on Fusarium head blight, but we wanted to cover this frost and freeze damage a little bit. So I guess I want to kind of stop right here and maybe open it up for questions.
Hey, Dennis, thank you very much, man, for the information. I have a couple questions. I know you're a little bit behind. Pretty much you're telling us now that patience is the key, right? So just make sure that not freaking out, wait to see if it's worth it to go and do anything. So going down right now and replanting everything might not, or plant another crop might not be the best idea right now. So that's what you're telling us?
Yes, very well put, Ricardo. Patience is something that you're going to have to exercise until we can really start seeing some of this damage. When it warms up, this wheat will really start to rapidly grow again, and you will then be able to clearly identify where the damaged stems are. But yeah, you're right. At this point, exercise patience. Don't make any rash decisions just yet, because we really don't have all the information at this time.
And Eric Anderson, he said he saw barley at flag leaf or boot stage in southwest Michigan, and he didn't see any injury, and the temperature was down to 25 last Saturday. He is asking you, how does barley compare with wheat with regards to susceptibility?
Yeah, so I think, this chart that I had up here, and I don't know if you want me to scroll back here to it, this chart here, I would think would be fairly similar. It's kind of a guide to go by. This isn't an exact, if you're going to hit 24 in exactly 2 hours, you're going to have injury. That's not exactly how that works, but it's a guide, and I would think this guide would apply to any of the small grains or cereal crops, like barley, oats, rye, and whatnot. But if it is in boot, like you said, notice the tolerance to cold temperature at the boot stage is a little bit higher. So it can't tolerate as much cold in the boot stage. So I would suggest that you get out and slice open some stems and look at the developing head and make sure that you don't have damage there. But again, you might be just a little bit premature to be making that assessment out in the field.
Thank you very much. One last question here. Does the lack of visible frost, the black frost, during a freeze event result in any more or less plant injury?
No, it's really a matter of what the actual temperature gets down to and the duration of that temperature. Because whether there's frost on the plant, if the extracellular water freezes, and whether there's frost on the plant, doesn't matter really what the dew point is. If you're right on the borderline, maybe the dew point could impact that a little bit. But with what the cold temperatures that we had, just the fact that there wasn't frost is not a reason to say, oh, well, my wheat's going to be just fine.
Dennis, thank you very much, sir. I really appreciate that. And I think right now we have a couple of slides that Phil going to take care of.
Let me introduce next week's topic. Dr. Erin Burns is going to talk about post-emergent weed issues. She will be on here for the virtual breakfast at 7 a.m. Next Thursday morning. Join in for that. And then just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you very much.